Hello and welcome to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. It's also a pleasure to be joined here in the studio by three of our area legislators who I'm sure are familiar to all of you. We're really pleased to have with us today Senator Dick Sears and State Representatives Cynthia Browning and Kathleen James. Senator Sears is one of Bennington County's two state senators, and Representatives Browning and James represent the district that includes Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and most of Sunderland. Thank you all for being with us today and carving out the time to talk to us a little bit about the legislative session that just passed and what we may have to look forward to in the months ahead. So I guess I thought we could sort of begin at the end of the session there. You had an interesting adjournment situation happening where the state Senate and the House adjourned on two separate dates. You were unable to come together with a compromise package over two bills, paid family leave and minimum wage. So I was thinking perhaps you could all walk us through kind of what happened there and what were some of the sticking points that prevented a compromise from emerging around those two bills. As I understand it, the House was hoping to see a more robust paid family leave plan come out than the Senate wanted, whereas in the House you were planning to see the minimum wage increase to $15 an hour extended out a little bit from 2024 to 2026, whereas on the Senate side you were hoping to see that minimum wage come a little bit earlier. So why don't I let you all tell us kind of what was going on up there and where do you see this headed when you reconvene in Montpelier come next January? Senator Sears, you're the most senior here.
Thank you. Well,
I usually pick on Representative Browning for that, but it's your turn this time.
I just start off with being honest here. I didn't vote for the paid family leave bill in the Senate. I couldn't support it. I felt that it raised taxes on those who could least afford it. And so I had problems with it. Also, we had a brief discussion before we started here about the budget. And if we're going to raise $24 million or $80 million, as the House plan did, in new taxes, then we had a lot of other programs that are underfunded that should be more funded better than they are today, rather than starting a brand new program. And I really felt that was, for me, that was the real kicker. What happened was the differences, the idea was that the Senate would go first on minimum wage, pass a bill. We passed a bill. I voted for it. It was eventually $15 by 2024. The House didn't feel the same. And then the House passed a very large paid family leave bill that would have resulted in taxes of about $80 million, as I understand it. The two sides couldn't come together. But what happened, and I've only seen it happen once before in my time there, was we signed off on I was part of the budget negotiating team, and we signed off on the budget before they finished the paid family leave and the minimum wage. Once you sign off on the budget, that's a signal it's time to go home. And I think that the leadership of both the Senate and the House made a mistake. Shouldn't have had that, even though we came to an agreement, you don't have to sign it, and that means you're still open. Once they did that, that was a signal that it was over. They couldn't come to an agreement. The governor wisely stayed out of it, I guess. I don't know that he would have vetoed both bills, but he was likely to have. So you had that. But you also had other issues going on between the House and the Senate, not the least of which was every time the House voted to raise the tax, it seemed like the Senate balked or didn't do it. So, for example, when they raised the cloud tax, Senate said no. When they raised rooms and meals tax, Senate said no, and we funded the clean water bill with current revenues. So that, those kind of battles were ongoing. And then the Senate passed what I considered a strong marijuana tax and regulate bill. The House balked. They got it through government operations in a struggle that, and I have nothing but respect for the chair of that committee and the work she did, and to get that through her committee. But then it got to the Ways and Means Committee where it sat, and it's like I'm saying, 4 years to study this thing. Come on, let's go. It's the fourth or fifth time the Senate's passed the bill. So there were a lot of struggles between the House and the Senate as I see it. So it's not surprising that we ended up with that kind of a messy adjournment. One of the, we'll get into it later, one of the unfortunate things was there was no adjournment motion to allow for a veto session, which means that any bill the governor vetoes has to wait until January to be to have an override vote.
All right. Cynthia, what was your takeaway on all of that?
Yeah, I would substantially agree with Senator Sears' characterization, although it's important to hear his perspective from the Senate. I think that basically he's correct that each chamber had its own priority and wanted more than the other chamber was willing to give. And at the end, the last offers that were apparently being made were sort of like some from column A, some from column B, just like what combination could you get through? And I personally don't think that's a good way to establish new programs or make important economic policy decisions. So I was actually glad that those two bills did not move, because I think we may be able to get better bills in January. And I know for the people that cared about those outcomes and wanted them sooner, that's cold comfort. But I do think the governor might have vetoed one or both of those. I couldn't support the version of either of those bills, the minimum wage or paid family leave, that passed the House. I agree with Senator Sears about paid family leave, that if we have other things that are ahead of that in line if we were going to raise payroll taxes. I would have wanted to start a much smaller program that was really an insurance program that people could opt out, so they'd be paying voluntary premiums rather than a tax. Because I admit the need for that program. I just don't see that that's what we should use our taxing capacity on right now. And the version in the House was just really big. The minimum wage, I supported the minimum wage increases that began in 2014. I'm just concerned I don't want to do those increases too far too fast, because I don't want to hurt some of the very people we're trying to help, people that might lose benefits when they get higher minimum wage and end up no better off, people who might lose hours or even lose a job, people who might lose benefits because their employers are not going to give them benefits if they have to pay them a higher minimum wage. So I felt the House was trying to address some of those issues, but they didn't really get it into a form that I could support. And I think that having this target of $15 by a certain period of time is an artificial political target, and you need to base economic policy on the reality of Vermont's economy. We have very different regions in Vermont with very different wage structures. We have a lot of small businesses. There's been no exemptions for small businesses. So I think it's really important to be careful about that policy, and I'm hoping that when we come back in January, we can do a better job. I'm hoping that there are versions of these bills that I can support. And I would just say, in terms of the veto, I don't know what Representative James heard, but I did hear that there were problems of being sure when the House, everybody in the House could be there. And I'm not sure, at that point, I don't believe Governor Scott had appointed Representative Forguy's replacement. And so the Democrats would have been short, so veto overrides would have been, that's my understanding, that some of the considerations about not worrying quite so much about having the veto date that we usually do. That's what I heard. I don't know for sure. I don't know what you heard.
A lot of moving parts to all of this. Yeah. Representative James, what was your view on all of this that was going on?
Well, as a newcomer,
must have been fascinating.
It was amazing. It was very interesting. I walked in the last day of the session, or what turned out to be the last day of the session, fully prepared to take a vote on what I thought would be a compromise version of paid family leave and minimum wage. I had thought and had heard from colleagues up until the last minute that a deal was going to be struck, and I really had mixed feelings. Part of me agrees with Cynthia. I was the paid family leave bill in particular is very important to me. I did vote for the House version of the bill. I've seen it from the very beginning as a real game changer for small businesses, giving them a way to offer a really kind of life-changing benefit to their employees that many small businesses can't otherwise offer. So I've been a big proponent of paid family leave. As it was envisioned by the House, I saw how it was changed in the Senate and thought, well, if it gets it going and gets the program started, I'll vote for it. Minimum wage has always been harder for me. For that same reason, I guess, a concern about the small businesses that, as we all know, are the backbone of the Vermont economy. I wound up supporting and working very hard with a small group of my Democratic colleagues to support the version of the bill that wound up coming out of appropriations and making it to the House floor. It was a little slower than the $15 by 2024, which, didn't please the progressive wing of the party. But it was also faster than, and Cynthia, I can't remember whether it was your amendment but there was also a slower option.
That was
on the
my
floor.
amendment.
I thought that was your amendment. For me, that was too little, too slow. It took too long to get there and had too many triggers built in. So the version I wound up voting for and was very happy to support would have tied that annual wage increase to inflation, gotten to 15 by about 2026, and had some triggers built in case of a recession. And that wasn't something that the Senate in the end could go for on the compromise. They thought it moved too slowly. So when it became clear to me that we weren't going to be voting on anything and that we weren't going to be coming back and that both of these bills were going to have time over the summer and that we'd take another look at them in January, I was disappointed, but at the same time accepting, because if we come back in January and there are better, stronger versions of both bills that can get that broad coalition together, the wait will have been worth it. I think one thing that I observed a lot during this session, I never ran on or campaigned on the so-called supermajority in the House. And, it did wind up being a byproduct of the 2018 election. But one thing that I really observed with a lot of interest this session was, what it really means to have a so-called supermajority. To me, it's 100 voices, 100 different perspectives, many different communities represented, and it's always going to be difficult, I think, to try to pull together those kinds of broad coalitions, especially when you have a bunch of freshmen coming in like me who are, a little bit untested. You don't know ahead of time always how you're going to vote on a particular bill by the time it makes it to the floor. It's, one thing to say I support a minimum wage increase, another thing to read the fine print, and see what the final piece of legislation is that you're going to vote on. And in all the dinners and conversations and, communications I had with all my freshmen, I know that we were grappling with that a lot. It's like, this is what the bill actually looks like when it hits the floor. And this is your first chance to actually take a vote on that bill. So how are you going to come down? And, you don't always feel how you felt exactly as a newcomer campaigning. So that was a really interesting learning curve for me as well.
Do you think the governor's idea of having a sort of a voluntary opt-in two-state, situation with New Hampshire, that seemed to kind of go nowhere, but is there any life in that idea?
I feel that trying to work with another state is just impossible. First of all, they have divided government right now, too. I think it's hard enough to get agreement within your own state. So the proposal that I had was to have a program where everybody would be automatically enrolled unless they chose to opt out. So you could still opt out, but if you qualified for the program, when you're doing all your W-2 and everything with your employer, you're in unless you sign the form and say, no, I'm not. So there would be that voluntary aspect, but it would not be requiring you to opt in. It would be you're in unless you opt out. So that was how that actually was an approach that started last year in Ways and Means with the late Representative Jim Condon, the idea of a voluntary program but having it be opt out. And I still think that's a viable approach, and it avoids the tax issue by having this voluntary element. So to my mind, oops, I keep touching my microphone. To my mind, that option is very, very much alive. And the key thing is, when we talk about the veto-proof majority, I'm one of the votes that's in play, and they may not need my vote to override his veto if he vetoes something, but I made it very clear what kind of program I support. And so if they want my vote, that's the direction they need to be able to go. Now, I agree with Kathleen. We'll see what comes out after the summer and fall and what kind of new versions we have. But I think the idea of allowing some kind of opt-out that retains that flexibility that I think Vermonters want, I think that's an important element.
Will there be some sort of, I'm sorry.
Well, and the hesitation I always had with that approach is the feeling that, as always with insurance, it's going to be the people who think they are going to need to draw down on that benefit soon or in the near future who are going to opt in. It's going to be the people who think, I don't need it. I'm going to save the money this year, who opt out. So you're skewing the pool. You've got the people who are most likely to take the benefits in the pool. You've got the people who think they're not going to need it opting out. So the rates go up. So then people think, wow, this program is really expensive. I'm not going to opt in, and it spirals.
But I think the way to get around that is that you make it so people have to take that explicit action to opt out. So so some people may just stay in out of inertia. But the key thing is that if it costs more for the people who want it, they're the ones who want it. They're the ones who should be willing to pay for it. And I think that if we find out that the people who say they want it are not willing to pay what it costs, why should that cost be imposed on people who don't want it?
I don't see the Senate going along with an opt-out. I just don't see them doing that. I think that whether they have the votes or not, I don't know whether the House has the votes to override. Yeah. I think any agreement will come between the two committee chairs and the senators and House members who are on the conference committee. The minimum wage, I strongly supported the $15, the quick for the House and the Senate version. I think it helps to lift all boats. I've heard all the arguments against minimum wage for my whole time there, and it does seem to improve the situation for a lot of people. But where would we be if we followed the federal minimum wage?
Yeah.
So I'm a little different than Cynthia and Kathleen on this, but in terms of the paid family leave, my guess is that they'll come to some agreement that won't include the opt-in. And they may have to work with the governor at some point to see what he would accept.
Or if they made it
I don't know that, I want to get into the details of what might or might not happen or what I'm not ready to say, yes, I'll support this opt-in. I know what I don't support, and I don't support raising taxes to pay for the program when we've got as many unfunded mandates and underfunded programs as we have right now in this state.
And I'll add one thing, which is that on that final day, I've thought a lot about the minimum wage. It's been my most difficult vote because I hear from so many small business owners who really are struggling with the concept. But ultimately, philosophically and in principle, I agree with you, Dick. And I had walked in the last day knowing that I would vote for whatever minimum wage bill made it to the floor. I can't see myself voting against a minimum wage bill. So I was ready for that to get my vote.
Let's just remember that we have raised the minimum wage 4 times since 2014, and it will continue to go up with inflation under current law.
But it continues to lag behind the living wage.
I understand that, and I'm willing to contemplate more increases. It's just I want to be sure the audience understands that we have done things.
But the disparity between those who are nationwide in this country, one of our biggest problems is the disparity in income today between those that are working hard, 2 and 3 job families, trying to put food on the table and pay for the bills, when you've got others who are, there's no way, the present tax cuts, for example.
Oh, yeah.
from the federal government. You know, this is the one thing that we can do to lift the boats a little bit. And I realize it's tough on small business. I used to have to make a payroll.
Yeah.
I had to do that every 2 weeks, and had to make sure we had the number of kids in the program, blah, blah, blah. It's difficult. I know how difficult it is when you have to raise those salaries, but I'm looking at people working at $12, $12.50 an hour now. That's pretty hard to get by on in this economy. And so people are working 2 and 3 jobs, and other people have kind of given up. And that's part of the opiate crisis that we're facing, quite frankly, that a lot of people have given up.
But just
And the Senate
remember,
approach that is the strong argument for the Senate approach, and why ultimately I decided I would vote for whatever made it to the floor, is that it gets people to what the JFO determines as a living wage soon.
But you guys are trying to offset the egregious effects of the federal tax cuts for high income and large corporations with the minimum wage. That's not going to work. Be better to raise income taxes on Vermont high income Vermonters and increase the earned income tax credit. I just think that the minimum wage is not the only tool we have, and we need to be sure we're not going to hurt the people we're trying to help.
It's the bill that can pass.
Well, needless to say, you'll have a lot to talk about in January when you get to Montpelier.
Moving on.
Sounds like more to come for sure on those 2 fronts. But a couple of other bills, pieces of legislation that you folks passed that the governor has now weighed in on in the last week or so that I think we should probably touch base on a little bit here. There are 5 in particular that the governor's either signed or vetoed in the last week or so. And just yesterday, we're here on Tuesday, June 18th, the governor vetoed the medical monitoring bill, which I know, Senator Sears, you were a co-sponsor of.
That went through the committee that I chair, Senator Sears.
That would have made it easier for Vermonters to sue companies that have released toxic substances.
For medical monitoring.
Right, and require them to pay for the medical testing for possible health effects. Where do we go from here? Is this a bill that we revisit in January?
I don't know that we have the votes to override the governor's veto in the Senate. We had a 19-11 vote, and it would take 20. So whether or not somebody would change their mind or not, I don't know. It's tremendously disappointing to see the governor veto the bill. And it's disappointing to me personally because it's my constituents, my neighborhood that was adversely impacted. And I want to make clear what we're talking about is not, lawsuits to collect millions of dollars from the companies. This is a lawsuit to monitor the medical condition of these people with heightened levels of a toxic substance that is in their blood system or in their systems and is going to affect them adversely. So you go to court and you have to, today, you can go to court to sue for medical monitoring damages. This is not about, when it left the Senate, it had a strict liability section for other damages like for the rest of their lives, these people are going to have to pay for town water in Bennington because they had wells. They had their own wells. They're going to have to pay for a lot of other, home values have gone down, things like that. So that's one thing that the strict liability was to deal with. But talk about compromise. I thought I had reached a compromise with the administration, the Attorney General's office, and the House Judiciary Committee, that we would strike the strict liability standard, move in to allow the suit to go on against the manufacturer of the substance, so the chemical manufactured by DuPont or Dow or whatever, you would sue them for the strict liability portion, but the medical monitoring would stay strong. And, we know that certain cancers are likely to happen as a result of that toxic exposure. And medical monitoring is just monitoring that to try to detect those cancers early so that they don't end up being deadly. We all know that the earlier you detect a cancer, the more likely you are to survive. I'm talking about life and death. So there's people in North Bennington right now with 300 times the level that would be normal to have in your blood of PFOA, direct result of ChemFab. And I'll remind people that ChemFab left Vermont because of Vermont's environmental regulations, went to Merrimack, New Hampshire, and performed the same sort of pollution in Merrimack that the people there were dealing with. So we passed what we felt was a strong medical monitoring bill. There was an amendment on the House floor before third reading to allow for the term significant risk to be added to the bill, which a number of us discussed with the House Judiciary Committee and felt that that would make it much more difficult for Vermonters to achieve the medical monitoring standard. It got defeated in the House. The governor says, I would have signed it if it had been in there. But yeah, that would have been, to me, a much weaker bill. Maybe there's somewhere in between there that we can work on. I don't know. But I do know this, that if you live in North Bennington and Bennington and you have been subjected to this PFOA, you're living in fear, not just for yourself, but for your family. You know, the people that I talk to, my neighbors, had kids grow up, now off in college, and to get them to come back at the state's expense, I remind you, to get the medical monitoring is very difficult. They're, moved all over the country, in some cases all over the world. So that's what this bill would have done, would allow you to sue. It's not a slam dunk. You have to prove that the substance is toxic, that it is likely to have a risk. So, that was the bill. I'm deeply disappointed in the governor's action. I thought that given the way we scaled back, and we also, mainly large businesses and corporations, we exempted things like shooting ranges and farms and other things. So we did our best to try to make it as palatable as possible. Right now, there's a federal lawsuit going on, and Judge Crawford has actually ruled at a lower level to the medical monitoring in this particular case. And right now, it still obviously hasn't been settled, but we'll see where it goes.
And this is the second year in a row, though, the governor
Second year in a row, he's vetoed it.
I supported the bill last year. I voted to override his veto. I supported it again this year. I do think it was important that we tried to create something that could get all the way through, even if it wasn't as strong as we might have liked. And I'm very disappointed that the governor vetoed it. I'm not quite sure what would happen on a veto override, but I really honor the efforts of Senator Sears to show that companies have to be held responsible for what they do, and that they can't just externalize their costs by imposing the cost on the rest of us. And the fact that in order to really have a healthy economy, you have to have a healthy environment because of the economic impact of this kind of toxic release. And so I don't think we can ever think about, well, we have to have these jobs, so we have to tolerate that pollution. No. In order to have a healthy economy with good jobs, valuable homes, healthy people, we can't have the pollution. And I think this bill was part of a number of steps we're trying to take to say that a healthy economy and a healthy environment come together, and we're going to hold companies responsible for what they do. So I'm hoping that this bill will continue in some form until it finally gets through.
I'm a Senator Sears 100%. I'm a very strong proponent of the bill. I voted for it on the floor. I voted against the Beck Amendment, which I thought would weaken the bill. This bill already sets a high enough standard of proof for these people who deserve to have the cost covered. So I believe we got 100 votes in the House.
I think we did.
I hope we go for an override. I'm ready to vote for an override.
Absolutely.
And get this passed into law.
I don't know about the Senate, but I think we can.
I don't know. It'll be close. I think you never know. I mean, I've seen times before marriage equality certainly was one case where they somehow ended up with the 100 votes they needed to override Governor Douglas's veto. So we'll see.
We'll see.
Again, disappointing, but I was glad the governor signed some bills.
And we're going to get to those in just a moment, but let's just talk quickly about one that he also vetoed last week, the 24-hour waiting period.
I don't know if I should take this personally or not. The two bills that are vetoed came out of my committee and were worked on extensively by myself, either sponsored or...
Well, I'm sure you two can have a private conversation at some point and say, hey, what's going on?
We already have, actually.
So he also vetoed the handgun bill there that would have required folks who wanted to buy a handgun, you have to wait 24 hours, so could have a cooling off period. The idea being that maybe somebody's a little... not quite ready to own a handgun at that particular point, and a good night's sleep might be a good idea.
What do we know?
What do you think is going to happen on that?
I don't know. I don't think we'd have the votes to override that, and it's unfortunate. And I start out by, I voted against last year's gun bill that he signed, which included the magazine ban. So I'm not, it took a lot for me to get to a point where I could support this bill. And this bill was true compromise in terms of my committee and in terms of what we did. It started out, there were 7 bills in my committee having to do with firearms. 4 of those bills had to do with the magazine ban from last year and trying to fix some of the problems with it, one of which was the elimination of shooting contests as of July 1, and which is somewhat popular in many circles. They go to, places like Hale Mountain Fish and Wildlife Fish and Game Club, and they have shooting contests, and brings in a little money to the community. So this would have allowed them to continue. The second thing the bill did was it also a couple of other minor tweaks to that law. Then it had a section that nobody talked about that was very important to Chris Basardi, who's a doctor in the emergency room in Bennington, who's been a leader in the terms of what's called the red flag law that we passed last year with absolutely no votes, by the way. And that section would allow doctors to report without violating HIPAA if they felt one of their patients was a danger to himself or others by, stockpiling weapons or whatever, and then they could use this red flag law for law enforcement to be able to go to the court to have the firearms removed from that person. That was a very important little section of the bill that, didn't get a lot of notice. The handgun waiting period, what we did was we had a bill that was introduced that had safe storage section, and I believe it was a 72 or 48-hour handgun firearm waiting period for all firearms. We took a lot of testimony in Senate Judiciary, and number one, we felt that the safe storage was not necessary. We already have laws against putting children in danger. You may remember a few years ago, some parents from out of state rented a condo, had a big graduation party for their kids, and the kegs, a lot of drinking and with problems there. Those parents were held accountable for it. So parents can already be held accountable for negligence with their kids. But what we also found, what is Vermont's firearm problem? Vermont's firearm problem is suicide. Roughly 90% of the firearm deaths in Vermont are suicides. Studies in Houston, Texas, and there aren't many survivors from firearm suicide because it's such a lethal weapon. And studies indicated that most people have made a decision and bought the firearm within 12 hours of the suicide. And these are only people that survived, obviously.
That's interesting, because one of the things I heard about it was that the data wasn't there to really support the idea.
The data's there, that suicide increased in North Dakota that repealed their waiting period, and suicides increased there. So the data was there. The governor's letter, I don't know where he got his data, but the data was there. Secondly, we decided on 24 hours. I always thought the House would come back with rifles and add all firearms, but it didn't. So it was just handguns. The other thing that was interesting is in Vermont, the other deaths that occurred were domestic violence related. And those, as we all know, are generally impulsive acts. So that was another, about most of Vermont's homicides, and suicides considered a homicide, are either suicide or they're domestic violence related. There's very few deaths in Vermont, firearm related deaths in Vermont, that are strangers. It's not, it's if you follow the news closely enough, you'll see most of those cases are people that know each other. Mm-hmm. So we passed out what I felt was a compromise bill. We just talked about compromise with the minimum wage, compromise with the paid family leave. I haven't, we passed it in the Senate with a very strong vote. There was several no's, but those were to be expected. And then it passed the House with a very strong vote. It wasn't 100 votes. It's not veto-proof. But, it certainly showed strength. And I thought it was a good bill. And I'm disappointed the governor vetoed it. And I had a private conversation with the governor about it. I explained to him that I felt it was also avoiding having something, the issue isn't going to go away. And someday we're going to have to deal with Vermont's suicide problem. And we can say all you want about mental health. Suicide is not necessarily a mental health problem. People are going through a crisis and it's immediate. And maybe there's long-term cases, but we did study the subject. We did look in depth at as much information as we could.
And I did, again, I was backed this bill big time and saw it from the very beginning as a suicide prevention measure. We attended the public hearing and was very moved by the testimony of Andrew Black's parents. And that's the young man I know we've all heard of in Essex who, was experiencing an acute kind of short-term crisis, walked into a gun shop and was dead within a couple hours. I had some stats I was going to trot out, but Senator Sears pretty much hit the highlights, which is that most of the gun deaths in Vermont are suicides. And, it's a uniquely fatal way to attempt, to kill yourself. And so if we can put any kind of a, reasonable pause or cooling off period in that thought process to give someone who's in crisis one day, to change their mind or seek help, I think that is well balanced, against the rights of Vermonters to go out and buy a gun. I never saw a 24-hour wait as an undue burden on people. And I did want to add another thing that we heard sort of later in the testimony on the House side, which I thought was really interesting, was the possibility that this bill could have interrupted the guns for drugs trade, which is when people who want to buy a gun come up to Vermont because it's so easy to get a gun here. They get somebody who's an addict to walk into a shop and buy a gun for them. Boom, there's your drugs, here's our gun. And they go back to wherever they came from. There had been some hope that would interrupt that cycle as well, which I thought was interesting because that was not in all the early discussion and testimony of the bill. It wasn't something that I had heard about. So we heard a little bit about that on the House floor during the lengthy debate over the bill.
So I voted against the bill because it's ironic. I voted for the bill last year and I voted against this bill. But for me, there were some flaws. I understand that most of Vermont's gun deaths are suicide deaths, but I think most of them are with guns that people already have. And it's a very small number where, to the extent that we can tell, someone buys a gun and kills themselves within a very short period of time. So I was not convinced that the suicide deaths would necessarily go down under this bill if relatively few of them are with guns that people go out and buy, because there are a lot of guns in Vermont. A lot of people have guns already, and if you yourself don't have a gun, you know somebody that does. So I was just not convinced it would really affect the suicide or the domestic violence. Also, because it was just handguns, you could just buy a long gun, and you can do a lot of damage with a long gun too. So it just didn't seem consistent to me. I also didn't feel that we dealt in any way with the fact that if somebody already has a handgun and they come in and want to buy another or trade it, they have a 24-hour waiting period. Or the problem of gun shows.
No way to do that without registration.
I understand that, and then the question of gun shows and other sorts of things. So I didn't feel that I was sure enough that this bill would really make a difference, given the fact that you could buy a rifle, given the fact that most of the suicides in Vermont, to my understanding, and domestic violent deaths are with guns that people already had. So I was just concerned that we were going back and altering the question of the right to purchase a gun without enough evidence that it would really make a difference, given the fact that it was just handguns, not long guns in addition. So I opposed the bill, and I really don't think there were votes to override in the House, but we would have to see.
Okay, well, be interesting to see where this goes. My own thought is I wondered to what extent this was kind of a political calculation on the part of the governor after taking a lot of heat and blowback last year from gun rights advocates for the bill that he signed in 2018, that this was kind of just, okay, we've gone as far as we want to go for now, and this is just maybe it was just kind of a political calculation.
I don't think that will help in terms of that group. The governor.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to redeem himself in their eyes, but he may have made such a calculation. I don't
know what his motive was, but they're really, frankly, the NRA wasn't strongly opposed. They were opposed, but they weren't strongly opposed. The gun owners of Vermont were strongly opposed, but it wasn't like the bill last year, where you had gun owners who were really strongly opposed. The NRA took a view that there was something that they wanted, which was the shooting contests and the magazines. Yeah. And I think that that's why you didn't hear the same level of angst before he vetoed it that you might have otherwise heard. I think there was, you could argue on roughly 60% of those suicides are with a handgun. Or 60 to 70% are with handgun. Most people don't use long rifles, but again,
if they couldn't get it, they'd get the rifle.
Well, that's your argument, and that's fine. We all have our decisions to make when we vote, but I just was pointing out that the governor pointed to statistics that I don't think he saw the same statistics that we saw for some reason.
And to me, it's always, I feel so strongly about this bill and was very, very disappointed at the veto. To me, it's the value of some lives saved versus a very reasonable short waiting period that would have inconvenienced, I don't know.
Well, the rifles also, most of the gun shows are, rifles are the things that are being bought. And so what we're trying to do, that's another reason I don't think that the NRA was as opposed as they might have otherwise been. Not to say that they support it. I don't want to mislead anybody, but they just weren't vociferously opposed.
I think we'll have to have all three of you back for another show. We'll just talk about this one subject here. We could easily fill quite a bit of time on it. It's really quite interesting. But let's move on for the moment now to talk about two bills that the governor did sign that did pass into law within the past week or so, and that's the lead water testing in schools and also the plastic bag ban, or the single-use plastic bag ban, plastic straws and styrofoam food containers. Let's start though with the lead water testing, because Representative James, you were on the conference committee that helped refine the bill into a form that was acceptable to both sides of the legislature. Tell us what this bill will do and what will be happening when it comes into full effect.
Sure. Work has already begun. The Department of Health is asking schools and child care facilities to do an inventory of their taps by, I think, the end of June. So what the bill does is it requires all Vermont schools and child care facilities to test their drinking and cooking water for the level of lead, and then remediate any taps that are found to be over an action level of 4 parts per billion. And then it provides funding that should cover most of the costs of that remediation. The testing is covered fully, the cost of testing, and we worked hard to pull together a budget that would provide schools and child care facilities a reimbursement that we hope will cover most of the cost of swapping out impacted taps. So it sets a standard that I believe is the strictest in the nation, so it really gets us out in front on making sure that our kids are drinking safe water, because lead, as we all know it, is a very potent neurotoxin, and the damage is irreversible. So I think it's a good bill. I'm really happy to see it moving forward, and it was a great experience for me to sit on the conference committee. I mostly listened, but it was nonetheless a really great experience to watch those last minute negotiations and put together a bill that got the governor's signature and is already in play.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just so glad that we ended up coming together on this kind of a resolution and found funding for a large section of the costs. And I think, again, it goes to this idea that without a healthy environment, you don't have healthy people and you don't have a healthy economy. And remember that there's lead in the fixtures because lead was used in the solder because people did not understand the damage that lead could do, or that it could leach into the water in this way. So this is like a legacy. This is a historical issue that we are still dealing with, a little bit different, longer time frame than the PFOA. But again, it's a situation where we were using substances and chemicals, and if people knew about it, they didn't tell us, and now we have to deal with it. So again, it's part of the healthy environment, the healthy economy, and I'm very proud that both chambers came together on it.
What was one of the issues, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, was how this was going to be paid for in terms of state money versus local money. Where did we all wind up on that part?
So the final bill includes full funding for the cost of testing. So for schools and child care facilities, they pay nothing for the testing. And then we wrangled quite a bit on the reimbursement costs for the fixtures. In the pilot study that the Department of Health conducted prior to the bill being written, and now I don't have the stats handy, unfortunately, but anyway, a very large percentage of the problems found in the schools that participated in the pilot study were remediated to zero. The problem was fixed by swapping the taps. So to set that reimbursement rate, different committees did a lot of looking and took a lot of testimony on how much is it reasonably going to cost a school to replace one water fountain, to replace one kitchen sink, to replace one cooler. And those are the prices that we built into the bill at a reimbursement rate that I think in the final bill ended up at let's say 80%, and please don't hold me to that. But
that's my recollection, that
schools are going to
might have some cost if their cost is above a certain amount or something like that.
So they'll submit receipts, they'll get reimbursed, and we also put a section into the bill that allows schools to basically come back to the legislature if they get into the remediation and find that they truly have extraordinary costs. And hopefully that won't be the case, but probably one or two schools are going to find that they have a problem that goes beyond swapping out some taps.
Okay. And the plastic bag ban, I guess, fairly straightforward at this point. I think everyone sort of gets that.
Yeah, it was what was happening, and one of the reasons I think the governor signed it, even though there was opposition, was that you had a number of communities either have already voted on a ban or were proposing them, such as Manchester and Bennington. So if you had, 40 different bans, it would be very hard to enforce those on a local level. And I think that's one of the reasons the governor saw that whether the legislature voted and did a bill and he signed it or not, there were going to be bag bans in Vermont. And so rather than having 40 different types, we have one uniform, and I thought it was a well-written bill, but thinking back when we talked about the lead and what we didn't know, I mean, I remember, it's going to age me a little, I remember we had paper straws. And,
Let's go back.
We had
we
paper
will.
bags that were always ripping.
Right, yes.
Canvas bags.
And the reason that we went
hemp bags.
hemp bag would be an improvement. But the reason we went to plastic was because of the problems with the quality of the paper bag and et cetera. So, I think it's not recognizing what, the danger. I was in Honduras one time, and in Roatan, the island off of Honduras. And I was taking a tour with a fellow who was a relative of somebody I knew who had married this woman from Roatan. And Uncle Joe drove us around. And as he did, he took us to all the beautiful parts of Roatan, but he also took us to one side. And the pollution on that beach was something that I'll never forget. All the plastic that had washed up from the island, from the mainland of Roatan onto that, and I never forget that. And I think, it's certainly those who are saying, well, this is unnecessary, blah, 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 they should really see the damage we're doing with plastics.
And also, I consider this just a first step because I also think we have the whole issue of the recycling and the container deposit redemption because there's no deposit on plastic water bottles, iced tea, Gatorade, wine bottles. So the recycling market is not working well, and I think we need to expand that container deposit redemption system to have manufacturers take back their containers to reuse them or recycle them, and customers buying those products should pay the cost rather than local property taxpayers. So I think this is one step on a larger effort to try to reduce the flow of plastic waste that ends up in our rivers and oceans instead of being reused and recycled. But I'm very, very proud to vote for that bill. I'm just hoping it's just a first step on trying to address some of those issues.
One other bill the governor signed last week was one that's been in the news a lot, and that, of course, is the abortion bill that you folks passed that would basically prohibit the state government from interfering in a woman's right to abort a pregnancy. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, this would basically mean that if the U.S. Supreme Court were to hear a case on the subject and overrule Roe versus Wade, the landmark case in 1973 that first established abortions to be legal, that this state law would take precedence over that. That would remain an option in Vermont. But I also understand, and I guess I've always been a little confused by it, I understand this is sort of a multi-year process, that there's more to come.
There's two bills. There's two provisions.
There's two separate bills. Okay.
Yeah.
The one the governor signed would, if the courts rule that it's up to the states to determine what abortion is, what is allowed, then this would leave Vermont right where it is today. That's the theory. The second was a constitutional amendment that would allow for reproductive rights. That would be if it passes in the 21-22 session of the legislature, then it will go to the voters of Vermont for their vote of whether or not they would support the constitutional amendment, which would be a greater protection than this bill, were the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. There was a lot of misinformation, I think, put out about the bill. I'll let those in the House who had to deal with it first and deal with the misinformation speak to it first, but there was a lot of misinformation put out about the bill.
Yeah, I voted for H57 and for PR5. And I think what people misunderstood was that I heard often, or we heard often, that this was somehow an expansion or an extension of abortion rights in Vermont, and it's not. For the past 40 years, abortion in Vermont has been a private decision made between a woman and her medical provider, period. And what H57 does is set that down into statute, that's how it's going to continue to be here. There was a lot of, I thought, very misinformed information about, this allowing now suddenly abortions up until the moment of birth. That's not true at all. Abortions like that are performed, I believe, only in one place in Vermont. I think it's up at Fletcher Allen. A team of ethicists needs to sign off on any kind of procedure like that, and it is done only if the fetus at that time is determined to be incompatible with life, that's the phrase, or if the risk of the mother's life is in danger. And that is a gut-wrenching, horrible decision for any woman to have to face, and I couldn't believe more that it belongs between her and her doctor. And so I did vote for that bill, and it was an interesting way to get introduced to the legislature, because as a freshman, it was one of the first bills that came up. So within weeks of me being inaugurated, I was hearing from a wide range of constituents who had very, very strong feelings about this very emotional and very personal decision. So I was happy to see it passed. I think in the national context, we did the right thing. When you look at the incredibly restrictive bills that they're passing now in states like Alabama and Missouri, I'm really glad that Vermont got out in front on this and made it clear where we stand. That, in Vermont, a woman has the right to choose.
Yeah, and I supported H57, but I do think that the effort that we should all be able to agree on is to work to prevent unwanted pregnancies and increase access to contraception so that this situation is avoided. But I agree that we were basically, right now, without H57, there's no regulation on abortion at all. So by putting H57 in place, we actually put a framework around abortion that wasn't there before. And I think that was a good thing, and I think we did the right thing and put the right framework in place.
I agree. I co-sponsored the constitutional amendment, and that really is as close to Roe v. Wade as you could be in terms of how it was set up, because it does allow restrictions if it's in the interest, but there's it's restrictive on how you could restrict. But the constitutional amendment will be interesting to see, assuming it gets to the voters, how the Vermonters will look at that, given what's going on nationwide.
And that's what I like so much about the constitutional amendment. It was a discussion I had with a constituent who's passionately opposed to abortion on deeply held religious principles, which is absolutely her right. And, I was able to say to her, listen, if PR5 goes forward, you'll have a chance to vote on this. And I really like the thought that this issue would be brought to the Vermont voters in November 22 if it passes again in the next biennium.
Okay. All right, so that'll be on the ballot then in the 2020...
If it passes the legislature again.
Okay.
But the governor doesn't have a role in this, is my understanding.
He doesn't get to veto.
He doesn't get to veto.
Whoever the governor is.
But the next legislature has to pass it again, and then it will go to the voters.
Okay. We have a few minutes left, and I know we wanted to talk a little bit about the tax and regulate bill. Senator Sears, you've been a champion of that for a couple of years now, and as you mentioned earlier before we went on the air, I think last 6 years? 5 or 6 years, something like that.
4 years.
The state senate has passed a form of tax and regulative cannabis, marijuana. But this year kind of got bogged down on the House side, I guess.
Let me just try to respond to a couple
I'll let you start.
Couple of comments that have been made, not by the people here. First of all, no substance is a good thing. I'm not saying that marijuana is a good thing, that you should all be using marijuana. What I am saying is that we know that roughly 80,000, according to the RAND study, 80,000 Vermonters use marijuana on a regular basis. If that's not true, give or take 20,000 one way or the other, still a large percentage of Vermonters. Secondly, we know that without a tax and regulate system, you have people who are illegally selling right now, because other than growing your own, there's no way to get it. So you have an illegal market, both a gray market, which is the excess from people growing their own, as well as a black market that is active. They're also, we can't guarantee the quality of the product. We've heard that some fentanyl's been mixed in with some marijuana. We also have heard that there are a number of cases, I know in Chittenden County anyway, where people are selling it right out of storefronts. And they're not paying taxes on it. Seems to me to be fairly unfair. And if the state is serious about regulating the product, we ought to know what people are buying, as well as the edibles, which are being sold. There's some chef who advertised in 7 Days magazine about, he'd go and cook your marijuana for you.
I thought that was CBD. Was that marijuana?
No, it was marijuana. Yeah, people have been pretty open and bold on social media about buying on the illegal market. So the Senate has passed the Tax and Regulate bill. It's died in the House, I think, 5 times now, if this one doesn't make it through next year. We can argue about saliva testing. We can argue about all of this. The fact remains, people are using it. It's not regulated. It's not taxed. And your problem is still there. And now you've got Massachusetts selling it. Maine has also legalized it. And so people from this part of the state are able to go buy it legally in Massachusetts, come back, pay their taxes in Massachusetts. And I just think, there's going to be one in Williamstown right near Dunkin' Donuts. So.
To get the munchies. Yeah, well, the Tax and Regulate bill is actually in the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee that I sit on. And from what I can tell, because we got it several weeks before the end of the session, and we could have worked on it. And from what I could tell, there was some kind of decision above my pay grade that no, we're not going to try to do that. We're going, they were still working on paid family leave and minimum wage, and they were just, we're not going to try to do that. So they made a policy decision, but I do not think it is dead at all. I think there is substantial interest for all the reasons that you mentioned in doing it. I have always had grave concerns about the highway safety issue, but I see that as an issue that isn't just specific to marijuana, and I'm not sure that the saliva test solves that issue, so I'm willing to separate those issues and try to figure out what's the best industry structure, licensing system, taxation system for legalizing the recreational sale of this substance. So I'm willing to go there. I personally would rather see, instead of lots and lots of little retail establishments, I would rather see cooperatives or clubs where people have to become a member and the distribution happens through some sort of more restrictive setting, because I think that might avoid the question of all these little storefronts and what happens in towns that don't want it. But that's my personal position, and it won't keep me from trying to make the bill better, possibly supporting it in the committee. I don't know if I'd vote for it. It depends on how it comes out, but I don't think it's dead. I think there's substantial energy behind it, and that's one of the things that, again, maybe the off session will allow some sort of spade work to happen so that it can move in the next session for all the reasons that you say. But I do think that one thing that's very important to me is you're setting up a new industry. You're setting up the regulation for a new industry. You better put in place really good, strict regulations now, because once the industry is out there and has lobbyists, it's not going to get stricter. It's only going to get looser because they're going to push back against anything they do. I'm worried about the chemicals that are used in processing. I'm worried about how much energy it uses. I want to require use of renewable resources. There's a whole bunch of issues, because if you don't do this right, you're going to create all kinds of new chemical hazards and other kinds of hazards. So I think it's worth taking our time and doing it right. But I do think that the bill will move out of the House, and we'll see.
So if folks in the Ways and Means Committee next January come to an agreement and it passes the full House, the vote that occurred in the Senate this past March.
Well, there'd be a conference committee.
They'd have to reconcile whatever the differences are, right, because I believe there are already significant differences between the bills.
There would be.
Yeah.
Okay. We have just a couple of minutes left. Senator Sears, I know you want to talk a little bit about justice reinvestment too?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to mention that Vermont is, pretty quietly taken a lot of steps towards dealing with the problem of mass incarceration. And I will say that I'm proud that we are the first or second safest state in the nation in terms of violent crime. But we still have a large number of people out of state. We still have a large number of people who are incarcerated that don't need to be. And we have a large number of people that are incarcerated that need to be incarcerated. But you have to be able to figure out the difference between the two. And we have gone from having about 750 people out of state and gone from one of the fastest growing prison populations in the nation to one of the lowest growth rates in prison population. So we still have about 250 people out of state, which is a significant number, and Justice Reinvestment is designed to do as much as we can to bring those 200 people back to Vermont without building a new prison. There is a need for some new facilities, but when I say new prison, for that replacement facilities. So that's Justice Reinvestment 2. The Council of State Governments Justice Centers in the midst of working with the governor, the judiciary, and the legislative branch to form this cooperative, and we're waiting to hear approval from the United States Justice Department for the funding for Justice Reinvestment 2, which will continue to help guide us in Justice Reinvestment basically is a data-driven public safety measure. So you're looking first at what does the data tell you about the people that are incarcerated, people on probation, and what are some ways we could deal differently with that, with those groups. But it's also in keeping in mind public safety has to be number one when you have a correction system. That part of corrections job is to keep us safe. So there are certain people who need to be locked up, but there's certain people that are currently locked up that don't need to be. We need to be able to look at that. And one of the groups that we'll be looking at closely are those who are on detention. And Cynthia used to be on the corrections committee in the House, knows that while we've dropped all those other numbers, the detention numbers have stayed consistent for the last 10 to 15 years. They haven't dropped at all. So we still average that group. So we'll be looking at bail and other methods through Justice Reinvestment of ways to solve this. And we do save about $40 million a year in what we would otherwise be spending on locking people up.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing that's so important about corrections is being able. Most of the people who are in corrections will come out, and we want to be able to reintegrate them into the community. And also, there are many ways in which some of our other issues of mental health, substance abuse, poverty intersect with corrections, and so the work that's being done, led by Senator Sears, is really, really important in terms of, again, healing our communities and really bringing people back into the labor force where we really need them. So I think it's an example of sort of people talk about how we're so short-term oriented, but this program, 10 years, 13, 14 years now, this is an example of playing for the long game and of getting something done.
2010.
Yes, so it's 9 years. So I really think, and it's the kind of thing that people don't hear about very much, so I'm very glad you brought it up.
Yeah, speaking of getting people back into the workforce, we did pass a bill this year that will expand the number of nonviolent crimes that people can get expunged from their records or sealed.
That's right.
Which I think will help people get a job or find housing. So I was happy to
vote
for that bill as well.
Expungement is an important tool as well. And the record is that after about 7 years, from the time you complete all the requirements that you had as an offender, probation, paying off your fines, etc., you're no more likely to commit a crime than anybody else in the population. Secondarily, a study in Michigan that just came out indicates that people have a 20% increase in income after an expungement. Within 2 years of an expungement, which goes to your workforce development.
Exactly.
They're able to get better jobs, they're able to improve their life, and so.
It's a good bill.
Well, a long list of things we didn't get to talk about, but that's okay. We'll save that for the next time because
Yeah, this was a
I thank
pleasure.
all of you for being here. What an interesting conversation.
Thanks, Andrew.
And we'll have to have you all back again to get to the second half of our list. We never got around to. But anyway, that's okay. We'll save that for another time. I want to thank Senator Dick Sears, Representative Cynthia Browning, Representative Kathleen James for being with us today to give us the update on what the legislature did and may be doing in the near future. I want to thank all of you for being with us today as well. Hope you found the show interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.